Welcome to Just Theory. In this episode, we are speaking with Regina Schouten, professor of philosophy at Harvard University, where she researches the areas of social and political philosophy and ethics. Her most sustained research projects concern political liberalism and political legitimacy, educational justice, and the gender division of labor. We discuss the importance of choice of normative principles in the democratic order, the role of equality in theories of justice, and wide-ranging perspectives on liberalism. So, without further ado, I now present you episode 3, on the anatomy of justice. The worst part is behind us now. Emilia found the recording button. Well, Gina, welcome to Just Theory. We're absolutely delighted to have you. And we always opened every conversation exactly the same way. So if you could please tell us why you decided to pursue a career in academia and what made you stay.
All right. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and get to talk to both of you. I think that what brought me to pursuing a career in academia was just being caught off guard by how much I enjoyed philosophy. So I was a social work and Spanish major in college and really wanted to do something practical and, very concretely helpful in the world. And then I took a philosophy class and just really loved it and liked the way it invited me to think. And so I thought, well, I'll just keep doing that and taking those classes while I do this Spanish and social work. And then sort of gradually came to think about whether I might try to do something concrete and helpful in the world through teaching philosophy. And so I was very cautious. I still kept my Spanish major, graduated with philosophy and Spanish major, taught kindergarten for a year before applying to grad school. And then I did apply to grad school, but every year had tried to have a frank conversation with myself about whether I would still want to spend the next year in grad school, even if it were never to pay off with an academic position. And so I think I stayed because the answer kept being yes. And I still don't know if I had asked that question about a longer time horizon, if it would always have been yes, or if maybe one of those times it would have been no, but it always felt like if I took things just a year at a time, I could sincerely answer that I wanted to spend another year doing this, even if I never got a job out of it. And then I was fortunate to get a job out of it. And that was a little surprising to me. I think that through most of grad school, I was a little bit of an underdog in my own opinion, and in probably the opinion of my cohort and the surrounding cohorts. But I don't know. I had a lot of good luck and worked hard and ended up being one of the happy cases of somebody who stayed in it and was glad that they stayed in it.
Oh, this is amazing because we had some conversations in the past and it's actually a recurring theme that there's so much pressure. So I'm a grad student now and I know that there is a lot of pressure that we keep putting on ourselves, thinking that there is something else that we should be doing at any given point in time. Mm-hmm. And it's really reassuring to hear that a lot of super successful people just went, you know what, all you need to do really is work hard and really be passionate about it and just believe in your own luck.
Well, I'm not sure if Gina will agree following the argument in the second chapter, if all what matters is hard work. Sometimes so institutional arrangements, I'm actually trying to read into your book and your argument, but I feel that what Aleksandra said here, that hard work is all that matters, is not necessarily always true. Sometimes institutional arrangements could impact on our prospects and our career opportunities. I'm sorry, I did not even intend to intercept this point, but it just occurred to me that
yeah, you went right there. No, that's right. I have thought about this, whether I think that there's a sense in which you don't want to be like this very virtue signaling person who says, it was all a matter of luck and I got really lucky. And I don't know why you don't want to be that person. Maybe just because it feels too scripted, or maybe because like part of me does believe that hard work is like something like maybe not a necessary condition, but like for most of us, it's necessary. Most of us are going to have to work hard in order to be successful. But I definitely don't think it's a sufficient condition. And I definitely do think that, I got a lot of lucky breaks, and, the sort of structural incentives worked out in my favor. I was writing about the gender division of labor at a time where, like, it was still maybe like somewhat new to be doing empirically informed political philosophy. And, maybe already now, coming out of grad school with a dissertation on the gender division of labor, it would feel a little bit retrograde. But at the time, it was great, and it was something that there was a lot of appetite for, including on hiring committees. And so, but that wasn't planned. That wasn't like, oh, I just really had my finger on the pulse of the profession or anything like that. It was just, that was interesting to me. So I do think that's why it was important to me to always ask the question of, like, on its own intrinsic merits, is this year spent in grad school something that I want to do? And, I asked that question knowing that the opportunity costs for me were not nothing. I didn't come from a super, cushy background. So it wasn't as if, spending these years not earning money wasn't a little bit scary and difficult and kind of alienating from some of the people in my life. And so I think I didn't trust at the time that hard work was a sufficient condition for professional success, and I definitely don't think that now. And that's why it's really hard to answer these questions in a way that, like, supports inferences for people who are, like, looking for comfort right now, because I think it just really is hard, and it takes a lot of hard work, but it also takes a lot of luck, and it takes the structures to work out in your favor, which itself is a matter of luck, because those are fluctuating even as we're trying to sort of, like, work within them.
Amazing. And maybe to highlight, so we're lucky to see the drafts of a couple of chapters from your upcoming manuscript, The Anatomy of Justice, Liberal Egalitarianism for Liberals and Critics Alike. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why you decided to pursue this project and why now?
Yeah, I think that I have just always seen a lot of potential in a certain kind of liberal theorizing for generating concrete guidance with respect to problems of injustice that strike me as really important. And that increasingly seems to be a minority view, namely the view that liberal theorizing can help us think through injustice and guide us in reparative work. And so I wanted to think more systematically about why I believe that. And I think part of why I believe that is that whenever I hear the reasons for the more skeptical view, the view that liberalism actually isn't helpful if we care about equality, if we care about women's empowerment, if we care about racial injustice and all of these things, the reasons that are offered always seem to me like, oh, well, you're just, that's not the right way to think about liberalism. And so I just always have these moments in my mind where I say, like, but what if we think about it this way? What if we did liberal theorizing this way? And this way never felt like all that exotic, but like over time, I came to think that really to see the radical progressive potential of liberalism, you do have to think of liberalism this way. And even though in a way that's sort of how I had always seen it, it seemed like other people weren't seeing it that way. And so this book is sort of my attempt to say, but what if we think of it this way? And I really don't want it to be like fighting for a sort of theoretical apparatus or a set of theoretical tools just to like win the argument and say, like, look, so liberalism can do these things and you said it can't. I really want to try to make that case because I think not just that like we have these answers independently, and I want to argue that liberalism can get them, so much the better for liberalism. I think a lot of the answers we actually just don't have. And I think liberalism can help us reason to greater clarity about questions of reparative justice. And so we want it if we can have it. And then the problem, the detractors say, but look, it seems to shipwreck on all of these data points. It can't explain, the fact that we need to do this. It can't explain why we should defer to social movements in these kinds of cases, and why we shouldn't defer to social movements in these kinds of cases. And so the thought is, I can say, no, actually liberalism can sort of account for the data points that people keep thinking it can't account for. And then also to show that if that's right, then it's not just like, okay, cool, so we could use it. It's not like a bad theory. But then to say like, and moreover, here are these like places of unclarity where we don't have fixed points that we want a theory to account for. It can illuminate the right course of action in those cases. And so I think it really is a very sort of concrete, practical thing of wanting to show that this way of thinking about injustice is still one that we should have in our repertoire, our sort of like basket of tools. And I am not interested in trying to bring back a time where liberal theorizing was all there was to the game of thinking about injustice. I think people are doing great work using other sort of philosophical and political lenses to think about injustice, social epistemology, social ontology. I'm not trying to say we should sort of go back to the hegemony of liberal theorizing, but I don't think that it is without value, and that's the case that I wanted to make.
There are several very interesting points you've made there. One concerning the need for indeterminacy within a theory of justice, a space where certain points are yet to be articulated, or allowing for a measure of discretion within the theory of justice. But before we perhaps get to that point, could you tell us more about your concrete project and about your anatomy of justice? If I understand it correctly, it sits somewhere between or alongside Cohen's and Rawls's account of justice. Where do you sit on that spectrum between Cohen and Rawls, and how does your project differ from those two theoretical giants?
Yeah. So it's, you're absolutely right. Those are kind of the voices in my head, and so I think in some ways the anatomy of justice that I defend is much friendlier to what Cohen is trying to do. I kind of just think it's an accommodation. It's what it comes out of my reading Cohen and Rawls over and over and over and trying to understand this disagreement between them, which I think is so generative, but which at the same time I've always felt like in a way they're talking past each other. And so I wanted to work that out to my own satisfaction, the sense in which they're talking, like reading them and thinking like, yeah, but you're both right. You're just not talking about the same thing. And so that's what I'm trying to work out here. So, concretely, the book argues for a reorientation in liberal egalitarian theorizing about justice. And I argue for the orientation that I favor on grounds that it supports compelling resolutions to longstanding disputes and difficulties internal to egalitarianism, and then compelling defenses of liberalism against feminist and egalitarian critics. And so some of the internal disputes that I'm trying to deflate are the ones, I think, the distinct strands of the disagreement that arises between Cohen and Rawls. So it's maybe helpful to say a little bit about what I think of as the orthodox approach, which I think is exemplified by Rawls. On the orthodox approach, a theory of liberal egalitarian justice comprises a set of normative principles that are meant to guide the design and workings of social institutions. And normative principles purport to tell us what we should do, even if only defeasibly or in a particular set of circumstances. So for example, Rawls's normative principles of justice tell us that in relatively favorable circumstances where everyone is doing their best to generally act rightly, we should design political institutions so that those institutions work together to protect basic liberties, to ensure equal opportunities and competitions for advantageous social positions, and to ensure that any advantages attached to social positions work to the benefit of the least well-off. Now, following Rawls, many people think of these normative principles as realizing liberal egalitarian ideals. So whereas normative principles tell us what we should do, ideals capture the thing that we aim to attain by so doing. So for example, by arranging political institutions to comply with Rawls's principles of justice, we might be trying to achieve fairness or political equality. And at the most modest level of description, my proposal is to redirect the flow of our theoretical attention to the ideals that these liberal egalitarian principles aim to realize. But because it's really important that my approach is not idealistic, I try to avoid being misread in that direction. So I refer to the ideals as values. And by that, I just simply mean the things that matter. So they can be relational ideals like social equality. And among the things that matter to egalitarians, for example, are civic relationships of a certain character, fair distributions of social goods. So this redirection of attention already has some substantive implications for how we think about justice, but on its own, it's purely methodological. I'm just proposing that those of us who are thinking about justice should take a longer look at the things that matter and try to discern how their mattering stacks up against the mattering of the other things that matter before we turn to the work of systematizing those answers in the form of normative principles. So the slogan version of the project is, rather than normative principles, our theorizing should principally aim to produce evaluative discernment. And the book sets up a framework for doing that. But that framework is just part of the reorientation that I want to propose. So the proposal is for the framework in conjunction with a substantive way of filling it out, including a partial set of liberal values and a relationship among a priority relationship among those values. And I argue for this combination of the framework and the values, which is what I call the anatomy of justice, sort of on grounds that it lets us do things with theorizing that we should want to be able to do with theorizing. So it resolves difficulties internal to liberal egalitarianism. That's sort of the first thing. The second thing is that it shows that liberal egalitarian theorizing can actually be helpfully action guiding in circumstances of injustice, and that we can have a unified theory of justice that sort of tells us, if we wanted to know what an ideally just society would look like, given our history and culture and things like this, but also can give concrete guidance for where to go from here. And then finally, I argue that the anatomy supports compelling answers to longstanding feminist and egalitarian criticisms of liberalism. And so the Rawls-Cohen debate really is in that first part, that first part of how I want to argue for the anatomy of justice, which is that it really helps us make sense, not just of this particular debate between two giant figures in political philosophy, but it helps us really redeem the insights that they both were offering, really sort of understand and situate what each of them was getting right when they were thinking about justice.
I wonder if this is fair to say, or I wonder how to offer a simplified account of your argument for those of our audiences who are students and who do not regularly read Rawls or Cohen. Would it be fair to say that what you're trying to do with your project is to begin with concrete social values instead of beginning with abstract concepts of justice, and just trying to look at the concrete ground of justice first, before starting from I'm just trying to is there any way of putting it in very simple terms so our audiences, students, will kind of grasp the central idea in a single simple proposition?
So this is the thing that keeps me up at night, because I really want there to be a way of putting it in simple terms. But I don't think the proposal is that we should start with a more concrete. I think if anything, moving from normative principles to ideals takes us up a level in abstraction. And the thought is that that by going from normative principles to the ideals that those principles are supposed to realize in a particular set of circumstances, we actually make our theorizing more broadly applicable beyond those circumstances. So that if we want theory to actually speak to our circumstances, to our reality of profound injustice, we have to go up a level in abstraction in a way that makes it more relatable, because now we're talking about social equality, and now we're talking about distributive fairness. And those ideals have more purchase, I think, than when we talk about the normative principles that Rawls used to try to get us those social goods for circumstances of, like, no history of racial subordination and things like that. And so then the challenge is to say that we can theorize at the level of things that have that intuitive purchase, like social equality and distributive fairness, but we can get those ideals refined to such a degree that they actually do speak to our circumstances, so that we can say to someone who does think that fairness matters, but might disagree about our particular way of cashing that out, and say, well, so let's start with the ideal, and then we can sort of work together, and we can see where our premises split ways, and we can sort of make some progress toward thinking about reform in our social circumstances in that way. So I think the move from principles to ideals does help bring justice theorizing more within the reach of people who just sort of have an intuitive grasp on concepts like equity or fairness. But in a way, it's counterintuitive to say that the way we make justice speak more to our circumstances is to theorize it at a more abstract level. And so I think that's kind of the burden of the book, is to sort of say, like, it's counterintuitive, but look, I'm going to try to show you that it works. And part of what is motivating me is to enable us to do this work, this deliberative work together. So I am, a kind of public reasons liberal. I really want to be able to not just make the case that justice requires a quite demanding kind of equality, but to make the case to someone who is sort of antecedently inclined to resist that conclusion. And I sort of think that being able to make that case to such a person is part of the work of showing that it's not just something that we ought to do for the sake of justice, but something that we legitimately can do even in the face of disagreement.
I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit more about aspirational justice and vindictive justice and how they are related, because I do have to say that I was analyzing the diagram that you included in your draft, and I was really curious, and I wanted to use the opportunity that we have you here to have you explain it in simpler terms, again, thinking about our audience in mind. But it's interesting to me that with aspirational justice in a relationship with vindictive justice, but connected through legitimacy, but that legitimacy is also defined in a very particular way. So I would love it if you would be able to talk us through a little bit more.
Yeah. So I think, there's this disagreement in political philosophy that I sometimes think it's happening, but we're not quite knowing that it's happening, or then this is what causes us to talk past each other. So I think when some people think about justice, they're thinking about it as this concept that tells us what we should do. So for Rawls, principles of justice tell us something about how we should design social institutions, even if only for a particular set of circumstances. So there's sort of like it's justice as a concept. It's sort of this thing that fairly directly gives us guidance. And then there are some people who are thinking about justice in a different way. It's just something that that an account of justice will just tell us one way in which our social arrangement can be good. For people who think that this is what justice means, it just might be the case that like justice just is equality. So we should just want equality. And of course, we can't always get it without, for example, running roughshod over democratic processes, because people aren't always going to vote for equality. But that's fine. So we can say justice favors equality, but sometimes the thing that we have most reason to do is to just defer to democratic processes, or to do what's most efficient, even if it doesn't realize justice. And so there's this kind of sense in which that sounds really odd to the ear of a person who thinks that justice just is this thing that tells us what to do, that includes all of these considerations. Like you're telling me that justice favors equality, but that in these circumstances we shouldn't do it. Like that just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't compute. But in a way, they can reach all of the same substantive conclusions, because the people who think justice just is equality think that whether or not we pursue justice depends on democratic processes, and it depends on questions of efficiency, and it depends on questions of feasibility. And the people that think that justice is what we should do think that feasibility and democratic processes and efficiency are just a part of the package of the stuff that we call justice. And so what happens, I think, is that we try to think about what justice favors, what we ought to do if we want to live in a more just society. And we sort of think about it in terms of these fixed points, like, oh, well, your theory of justice can't be right, because if it were right, then we should sometimes prefer to make the better off worse off, even if by doing that we couldn't improve anybody else's situation, right? And whether or not that is a real problem for your theory just depends on what kind of thing you think justice is, right? If you think that justice was never supposed to be the end of the story about what we should do, then those kind of counterexamples aren't going to really bother. They're not counterexamples, because, like, yeah, of course, one consideration might sometimes point you in the wrong direction, but equality was never supposed to be the thing that matters all on its own. And so one of the kind of things that I'm trying to do with aspirational justice is to say, let's just set aside the part of the debate that's just trying to fight for that term. Like, which of us gets to call our thing justice? I like, just don't worry about that. One of these camps is has identified a kind of social aspiration, a kind of feature in virtue of which our society can be better, right? It can be more equal. And one of these camps has identified the package of all of the social aspirations, and they're calling that justice. But of course, we want both things, right? Sometimes it's going to make more sense to theorize at the level of what are the individual characteristics in virtue of which our society can be better. And sometimes we're going to know, like, all right, but what does the balance of those things tell us we should do right now? And so I say, like, let's just call both of your things justice, but try to keep track of which one is which. And now see if we can make some progress by considering our sort of like data points, the sort of fixed convictions against which we want to test our theory, in light of what those are convictions about. Are they convictions about the aspiration, or are they convictions about the sort of all things considered judgment of what we should do?
I wonder if we could try to test that theory based on, well, your argument in chapter 6 of the book, which to some extent applies and tests how the theory could apply to feminist context. And if we use feminist perspective as a form of ideology which informs perhaps justice, then there is a space for shift perhaps and change that your account of justice seem to be capable of accommodating. At least, again, maybe I'm wrong in my reading of your conception of justice, but I feel there is a space within your framework to accommodate and promote change if well, again, I feel guilty of doing that again, but I feel feminism begins with concrete situation of an individual who needs to be recognized. And if I'm correct, again, with the reading of your chapter, some criticism of liberal theories were addressed to the idea that liberal theorists prioritize dominant narratives or dominant ideologies, and feminist ideology was, so to say, left out from the picture. That emerges against the concrete background of practice and how women were being treated over the years, and how it is reflected in actual practice. So I just wanted to kind of touch upon this concrete example of feminist liberalism and the way in which your theory could perhaps transform the field from a dominant liberal traditional narratives that would focus perhaps not necessarily on that feminist account. Could you tell us more?
Thanks. That's really what
maybe I'm completely wrong about the reading, but that's what I thought when I was reading this chapter. I thought, okay, we're beginning with concrete injustice, and we use your framework to transform that injustice, and you say actually liberalism is adequate.
That's right. So I hope, sort of what you've just described is what I hope to accomplish with the book. And I really appreciate that you are framing that question in a way that suggests that you find it promising, because that's exactly what I'm trying to do. So I don't at all want to dispute the sort of feminist observation that liberal theorizing has sidelined the concrete, has sidelined the concerns of women. And a big thing that I want to do is to say that's not a part of liberalism as such. It's like a misuse of liberalism that happens to have sort of predominated a lot of the space for a while. But in a way, I also kind of want to defend the work of my contemporary liberal feminists, who I don't think are making those same mistakes, and to try to amplify that work a little bit, because I think that the sort of people who want to reject liberalism and sort of resist the possibility that it could have this kind of emancipatory potential are still relying on the same critiques. But I think that there are all of these possibility proofs out there for, like, what kind of social critique can liberalism underpin? And I think of my own, I hope my own previous work is such a possibility proof. But it's not being taken up as such by the sort of critics of liberalism. And so that's kind of what I want to do. I want to say, like, all of these criticisms can do really great work for us in terms of fueling internal critique of liberalism and try to figure out what the best version is. But they don't at all give us reason to resist a sort of feminist left liberalism, or to think that it can't do certain things. And in particular, in the chapter that I sent, I consider this thought that because liberalism has traditionally been, and in many ways still remains, a kind of state-focused way of thinking about justice, it can't adequately respond to ideology, unjust culture. In the chapter that follows that chapter, I talk about the methodology that characterizes liberal theorizing, and the worry that because it privileges the abstract, it can't treat as evidence for thinking through theory the claims advanced by social movements or the insights that come out of consciousness raising. And in both cases, I sort of accept the structural feature of liberalism that's thought to be to blame for these things. So I say, let's just consider a state-oriented version of my anatomy of justice. Let's just consider the methodology of sort of mainstream methodology of reflective equilibrium. And let's just take that as part of liberalism. In the case of the state focus, I don't really think it is a definitional part of liberalism. But what I want to do is try to take on the characterization that these critics have given and show that if you look at things the way I propose to look at them, liberalism actually must care a lot about culture. And even if we pursue liberal theorizing by way of this traditional methodology, it should treat as evidence in full stand claims advanced by social movements and the insights that come out of consciousness raising. So that's really what I'm trying to do. And one way of thinking about, maybe I could just give an example, because I do think that part of what's important here is to see how the concrete reality of injustice matters for liberal theorizing, even if we are theorizing at the level of ideals, and in my view, especially if we are. So I think of this ideal of equal opportunity. And even if we just sort of take the Rawlsian version, Rawls's principle of fair equality of opportunity tells us that positions that bring sort of like social advantages shouldn't be awarded on the basis of considerations of social class background, including racial background and gender. Now that's a normative principle about what institutions should do, but the point of that principle is to realize an ideal, and that ideal is the ideal of positions in society not being awarded on the basis of your social class background, or the ideal of your race or your gender or your social class not predicting what kind of job you're going to have in the future, or what kind of living arrangement you're going to have, or how much disposable income you're going to have, how much leisure time you're going to have. And so if we think about that ideal, right, the ideal of social class not predicting occupational outcomes, then that licenses very straightforwardly corrective action, because we're going to need maybe some affirmative hiring or some affirmative admissions if we're going to reverse the mechanisms by way of which social class background currently does predict your occupational outcomes. And so there's all this debate about, do Rawls's principles of justice allow for affirmative action? And in a way, I just want to set aside all this sort of hand-wringing about what Rawls's principles let us do and say, like, set aside the normative principles that say you should have your hiring be like this. What's the thing that we care about achieving? It's a society wherein your social class doesn't predict your occupational outcomes. Okay. Well, to get that, we're going to have to reverse some of the mechanisms that currently lead us away from having that kind of thing. And so we need to know what our ideals tell us to do. We need to know a lot about our status quo and how how social closure currently works in our societies. And so this is, I think, maybe one way to illustrate that, by thinking about justice in terms of the ideals that we're trying to realize and understanding them as concretely as we can, and as precisely as we can then conjoin them with like really good empirical information about what the world is like, to figure out, okay, how do we unwind the things that have gone wrong, given that progress toward realizing these ideals isn't going to be linear? How do we weigh them against each other to sort of set priorities in terms of reparative work, and answer questions like this? And I think that thinking about the ways in which we live in a society of pernicious gender norms works in the same way. Sort of what's the ideal that we want to realize, and what are the ways in which our gender norms currently are inimical to that ideal? And now we can think about, therefore, what does that ideal tell us that we ought to do once we contextualize it against all of the other ideals that are at stake? And this question of trade-offs really is the place where I think we want the theory. We want liberal theorizing, because sometimes making progress on one front comes at a cost on another front. So one of the chapters in the book talks about basic income and the feminist debate over basic income, where we have some feminists saying, women figure disproportionately among those who are materially disadvantaged. So basic income is going to be disproportionately beneficial to women. So feminists should welcome it on grounds of gender equality. And then feminists who think we have a universal basic income, then there is going to be all of these middle class women who no longer have any kind of financial imperative to stay attached to paid labor. And more women than men are going to use basic income to subsidize their withdrawal from paid labor. And so we're actually going to have an exacerbation of the gender division of labor, and therefore an exacerbation of gender norms. And I think that we want theory to help us sort of adjudicate the trade-offs that we are going to confront on the road to sort of social repair, given that we have all of these kinds of intersecting injustices.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that. You touched upon it briefly, but also in your chapter, you mentioned that the new framework can inform the way we think about our institutional arrangements and effectively our institutional framework in which we operate. I wonder how your theory translates into those institutional frameworks, and how could we enact the change in real terms?
Well, I think one of the things that it does is it tells us when we, it helps us think about when we defer to the outcome of democratic processes, because the outcome of democratic processes just tells us what justice is, and when we do it just because like we have to maintain a kind of legitimacy of the state. And so you might think about implementing something like a universal basic income, and the extent to which we should sort of push ahead with that kind of agenda in advance of developing democratic constituencies in favor of it, and the extent to which we should sort of like let it lag behind and try to like sort of change hearts and minds, and then we'll have more of a democratic constituency in favor of making that kind of institutional change. And I think you had asked earlier about legitimacy. I think sort of getting it right about the substantive and not just the procedural demands of legitimacy is really important to making these kinds of judgments about sort of when it's legitimate to pursue social justice, even ahead of the curve of changing public opinion. So that's, I don't know if that's the kind of thing that you had in mind when you asked about institutional change, but that's something that I think a lot about. I think in part because I am kind of always coming back to this thought that I think justice is really demandingly egalitarian, but I also think that we have to sort of preserve a community of justificatory reciprocity with people who disagree with us. And so that's, I think, part of where I want the liberal normative theory, because I want to think about not just like, what we ought to do to elevate the voices of the oppressed, but how we can make the arguments that that those voices are offering up legible and legible to people who aren't antecedently inclined to agree with them, and how we can sort of put the premises of those arguments in terms that don't try to like sort of settle the matter of what's normatively up for debate against those who disagree with the causes that maybe you or I think are closer to getting it right about what justice demands.
This is super interesting. And the reason why I asked this, and the general thoughts that keep spinning in my head every single time I hear about justice. So in my day job, I had a government program that transforms the legal sector with technology. So I'm more of a legal techie person. And one of our recent reports and research that we completed was on access to justice and how technology can enable better access to justice. And one of the debates that's very prominent in this space is just a general, everyday, every person definition of what justice entails.
Yeah.
And if you come at it from a more theoretical background, then of course, first person comes to mind, of course, Rawls, and then you get the entire tradition about around different types of justice. But what I found really fascinating is that when you shift the dynamic and shift the conversation from what people would normally consider social justice to enforcing of rights, or you extend the I would say the recipient or the subject to a sole trader or a business, and by expanding the definition, we really noticed that people's shifting around justice and institutional thinking around justice has shifted, and we are beginning to see the dial on even the interest in access to justice move more closely to where we want it to be, just by expanding the definition somewhat and making it literally everybody's best interest. Which is why I was very curious around, how do we enact the change when we are presenting it from a perspective of, there is a group, we present it as if it's a minority group who thinks that there are certain values that we want to promote. But in reality, I always had that intuition that when you start digging and when you start this dialogue with people, you can actually get a lot of democratic participation to further that idea that we, in effect, we all share. It's just a matter of, sometimes it's a matter of framing, and sometimes it's a matter of, inviting people around the table and
Yeah.
slightly changing the wording and slightly making it slightly more, touching them and showing them that it's not really just about criminal justice or some kind of like super niche definition of justice that we see, in mainstream media or whatever. It is actually about enforcing your rights and being secure in your legal position.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. I'm in a way, well, so yeah, that's just really heartening. And I think that another obstacle to sort of maybe helping people see that they do have these concerns, is that the way that we express our citizenship is often just through, absent the kind of intervention that you're describing, is just through electoral politics. And I think that even if people or have a kind of shared view about what a more just society would be, or what measures might promote justice now, there's such distrust about the good intentions of the people who claim to be speaking on behalf of those interests. And I'm not commenting here on whether there ought to be distrust, whether the distrust is like for good reason or not. Whatever you think about that, I think that's another obstacle to realizing that there's probably a lot of shared ground here. But I also feel like the left, I'll say, or people who broadly agree with me about substantive justice, often have abandoned some low-hanging fruit because it feels really concessive. So people don't want to talk about equal opportunity anymore because it feels like it's just a way to sanitize inequality. And I would really resist the abandonment of that ideal to the right, because I think that what we should be disputing is the empirical premise that there are deserved disadvantages that abound, right? So if you think that what we should care about is equal opportunity and not necessarily equal outcome, then you should be radically egalitarian relative to the status quo, because we fall so far short of that ideal. And a lot of the observed inequality of outcome is quite clearly traceable to unequal opportunity. And so that connection, I think, is the one that we have to make the case for, rather than saying, oh yeah, now equal opportunity is like the ideal of the political right and not the political left, and the political left has to move on to equal outcomes. Because I think, we care about more of the same things than we think we do. And I think if equal opportunity is a kind of value that even like at the level at which it's meaningless, it's just a slogan, equal opportunity, if that's a principle of justice that people across the political spectrum can get on board with, then let's just make the case that we fall so far short of it that the ideal of equal opportunity calls for quite radically progressive policy to promote economic justice. So that's kind of my take, especially in the domain in which I am writing about this is in the domain of education. So if you care about equal educational opportunity, then you should care about sort of radically progressive educational policies to equalize students' outcomes. So you don't have to make the debate be about whether we want equal opportunity or equal outcomes, especially when we're talking about children. And that's the power of that ideal, I think. So that's maybe just my own the thought that your experience having these democratic deliberations prompted for me.
Thank you. Emilia, have you got a question? I think we have time for one more.
Yeah, just to wrap it up, really. Right at the beginning of our conversation, you've mentioned alternative approaches to justice, alternative work on justice. What springs to my mind when I was looking at your work is that a lot of obviously your work is focused on social justice, predominantly social justice, distributive justice. And I was wondering, how does it hang together with perhaps other models of justice, corrective justice, where we're dealing with resolving disputes between individuals as opposed to shaping the relationship between the state and individual, especially when it comes to potentially feminist feminist approaches to that corrective justice you've seen, or we can see more and more pro-feminist shifts towards cases where individuals who would normally get criminal or remedy in criminal law can now also obtain civil remedies. So there seems to be parallel development, so to say, in justice between individuals in terms of corrective justice, not just shift in a larger social justice, distributive justice picture, if it makes sense. So I just wondered if your theory has a potential to talk to those other conceptions of justice with advancing the same substantive aims that your theory proposes. So is there any space for corrective justice, let's say, in your account of liberal, very much distributive justice?
Thanks for that question. That's so I think there is room for that, and this is not something that I've thought through. So this is just sort of thinking off the top of my head. Is that the way the expression goes? One of the ideals that I talk a lot about in the book that I think is a really important regulative ideal for thinking about how to arrange social institutions is mutual respect. And so I think about that in terms of the sort of institutional face of it. So how would we arrange social institutions if what we wanted to do was value a kind of civic relation of mutual respect? But of course, most straightforwardly, that's an interpersonal ideal relating to others on terms of mutual respect. And so I would think that one of the straightforward extensions would be to think of a primary failing that needs corrected in the case of interpersonal corrective justice as being a failure or a deficit or a violation of mutual respect. And I think, you know, we could deliberate about what kinds of policies that would favor. Presumably, if our existing criminal justice system is one that is very marginalizing of people who have harmed others and sort of excludes them from the deliberative community, then that's a kind of immediate grounds for reform that we could argue for. Sorry, that's an immediate kind of space for reform on grounds of interpersonal mutual respect. But off the top of my head, I would think that ideal could be expanded to provide sort of still further guidance about how we should be making decisions about corrective justice in cases of individual wrongdoing and like having a perpetrator and a victim, and we're trying to figure out how to either restore relations or to prevent further infractions or whatever the case may be. So I don't know if that's satisfying at all, but it does seem to me that there are avenues for expansion there, and maybe that's the one that strikes me as most promising from the start.
No, it's very, very interesting what you just said, because it seems to be the case that there are some values that inform various schemes of justice or forms of distribution of goods, burdens, benefits, but also correcting wrongs. So there could be a single value which informs, or single ideal which informs both frames or frameworks of justice, not just social justice, but also that interpersonal justice could be informed by the same ideal of mutual respect. So those theories do talk to one another, if it makes sense.
Agreed. Yes.
I think we've got some space now for the questions, Aleksandra, that we typically end our interviews with.
Yes, let's wrap it up, because I know we normally, as we said in the beginning, like once we get into it, we can just keep on going. So we have to curb it back, unfortunately, but this has been amazing. So the 5 questions. Number 1, who or what was your biggest inspiration in your career?
I think it's it's a who, and it's not someone from in academia. So I think probably my parents, and the way in which they're an inspiration is that they are sort of, for me, model this idea of like leaving things better than you found them, except they're like modeling the personal version of that. So try to do better for people than maybe you were done by. In particular, my parents always really encouraged me to sort of take risks and figure out what I was passionate about and pursue it. And I think this is a big part of why I felt like I could go to grad school, even though the payoff was very uncertain. And they worked really hard to be able to cash that check if I, if things went really badly for me. They definitely did not have a kind of life where they were encouraged to follow their dreams and take risks, not because, people didn't want the best for them, but it just, materially was more difficult. And so they sort of made career choices and life choices based on what other people needed of them. But there's no sense in which they sort of felt like, they both don't feel slighted by that, and they want other people to have more space for exploration and more sense of security in their exploration. And I just think that's, first of all, it was like, I would not have been able to consider a career like this or a life like this if they hadn't encouraged me along those lines. But also it just strikes me as really quite impressive that someone would be able to both not feel at all put out about the way that their own aspirations were limited, but still really invest in the expansion of other people's aspirations and not even just their children.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Question number 2. What do you wish you could tell your graduate student self?
Well, it's probably cheating to say that I would tell my grad student self, like, it'll be okay. You're gonna be all right. Things are gonna turn out really well. You're gonna be one of the lucky ones. But I think probably what I would say is I would encourage myself to remember that I was doing a lot of things for the first time, and that you're not doing your best work when you're doing something for the first time. This is something I remind my own students of a lot now. So I was constantly looking for a kind of evidence base about which to draw conclusions about my prospects for success in the profession. And I think I like systematically downgraded my estimation of my prospects for success because I didn't want to be like a victim of wishful thinking. And that meant that every time something went badly, I just really thought, oh yeah, so this is probably a good sign that I'm not going to be successful. So now I really have to have this conversation about whether I want to do this, even if I'm never going to be successful. I think like there was just a lot of unnecessary misery because I was always having this kind of like deliberative process. And in particular, I remember I just wrote a real turd of a paper once. First time that I really wanted the paper to be good, because I was in this class on egalitarianism. I was having this experience of like everything I read, I had thoughts about, and the thoughts about all the things seemed to cohere. And I was going to write a term paper that was going to like engage with this whole literature and like argue for an actually novel idea. And I wrote the paper and I felt really good about it. And then the professor was like, "This is not good." And he didn't pull his punches, which was great, but I was devastated. And I think that, in that moment, lots of people supported me. I had mentors who were great and who said lots of great things. One thing that I could have benefited from hearing in that moment was, this is the first time that you tried to write that kind of a comprehensive paper and you really cared and your heart was in it. And we just don't do anything at our best the first time we do it. Or if we do, maybe we got lucky, or maybe, we're just like naturally brilliant, but that's not a requirement for success. You don't have to be naturally brilliant. You'll do it again and you'll do it better. And you'll do it better even if you never really figure out what went wrong this time, but over time you will figure out what went wrong this time. So I think that sense of like knowing that this is all very new and you haven't peaked yet, so you're not like supposed to draw conclusions about your potential from your current performance. I think that's so obvious, but I didn't see it at the time. So maybe that's something I would have told myself.
I mean, what I'm hearing is it's hard being a thinker.
Yeah.
Generally.
Yeah.
If you could only read one book for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Yeah, I feel like this is gonna expose me as, I don't know, like a fraud or something, or not having the right literary taste. But I think if I wouldn't want to answer this question in a way that ruled out the possibility of reading to my kids. So I think I would choose Robin Hood, and I would choose the sort of kids version of Robin Hood, because I really like Robin Hood. I like the story. I think there's a lot of great stuff in there. And it's something that I would enjoy reading to my kids. They make me read the same things over and over anyway. And so if I could only read one thing for the rest of my life, I think I would probably just try to figure out like the thing I most love reading to them and choose that. And I sort of feel like that could span a large age range for both of them. So I'm sorry I don't have anything better.
That's a pretty creative answer, to be honest. Very pragmatic too.
Yeah.
I think Rawls would be impressed as well with his commitment to distributive justice.
Excellent.
It's like Robin Hood. It's the marriage of the two worlds.
Yes, I love talking to kids about whether Robin Hood was a good person. And I feel like there are different levels at which you can pitch that question, depending on the kid's developmental stage. So I think I think if I actually, I mean, that's what I was like, if I were actually in the situation, and I think that's what I'd really pick.
Amazing. If you had not been an academic, what alternative career would you have chosen?
I think I would have been a kindergarten teacher. And I think probably just because that's what I did in that span of time between college and grad school. And I liked it enough. And I think I sort of felt like I'm not really that good at this, but I think I could be with time. And I think I could get good enough at it to really enjoy doing it. So I think that's probably the path not chosen.
I mean, it's not that far out of teaching at university.
It's
so
really not.
Finish this sentence. One thing no one talks about in academia is.
I should really be willing to finish the sentence because fortune favors the bold and all that. But I feel like I'm familiar with so small a part of academia that I feel like anything I say, there's just going to be like, people are like, no, but I'm talking about that all the time. So I'm going to try to make my answer maybe more moderate. So I think one thing that people don't talk about enough in academia is the thing that critics of academia are getting right. So there's all this, at least in the US, but I don't think it's unique to the US, all of this public distrust of and backlash against universities and academics. And I think there's this knee-jerk reaction, part just defensive and part because a lot of the distrust is unreasonable, to sort of dismiss it all. And you know, we have these sort of slogans like trust science and I think it's easy to think that the public distrust toward academia is unreasonable distrust, but I don't think it all is. And I think that we don't talk enough about first how to restore it, whether it's unreasonable or not, how to try to sort of repair relations with you know, the parents of the students that we teach, the families of the students that we teach, the communities where people aren't sending very many students to college. But also, you know, what parts of the distrust are really on point and really push us in ways that we should treat ourselves as more accountable for. So that I think that's something that we should be having more of a conversation about, where we're giving more uptake to the kinds of concerns that are driving this distrust and this hostility toward higher education.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for sharing your insights. Emilia, would you like to wrap up?
Well, thank you so much, Gina.
Thank you.
I don't remember when I had such an insightful conversation about roles. It seemed to be one of those authors who many students simply assume to just be there to be absorbed and taken for granted instead of being challenged. And I feel like your insight very much challenged at least my thinking of roles, and I hope also how our audiences think about it.
I have to add to that, Emilia, because I feel like you're getting at Richard Mullender's motto, who is a member of faculty at Newcastle Law School and actually That's one thing he said to me in a seminar when I was an undergrad that prompted me to pursue an entire line of activity in legal theory. He said, and we were discussing heart at the time. And I was like, I was clearly disagreeing, but I was scared to say it because I was, 22. And he said, be an active participant in a debate. And I think, Gina, this is also something that really comes across very strongly in your book. And we're super grateful that you shared your draft with us.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm so grateful for this conversation, Aleksandra and Emilia. This has been a pleasure and also very generative for my thinking. So I really appreciate, and I appreciate the podcast and the opportunity to be a part of it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Hi, it's Aleksandra here. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you like our project, have any questions, or would like to recommend a guest or a topic, drop us a line on just.theory.project@gmail.com. This season was made possible with the generous funding of Newcastle University. If you like, you can buy us a coffee. Your support will enable us to continue our work. Just Theory, changing the face of legal theory.